The courtroom was expected to end with a routine plea deal. Instead, it turned into a tense exchange that changed the entire hearing. The defendant was facing 2 criminal charges: driving while intoxicated, DWI, and assault of a family member. Under the proposed agreement, he would receive time served on the DWI and 13 months of deferred probation on the assault charge. On paper, it looked like both sides were ready to move forward. Before accepting the agreement, the judge carefully explained what it really meant. He warned the defendant that a DWI conviction would stay on his record permanently and that any future DWI offense would carry much harsher penalties. Then he explained the assault charge: although deferred probation could keep a conviction off his record if completed successfully, it still came with an affirmative finding of family violence. That finding carried lifelong consequences. The defendant would lose his right to possess firearms or ammunition, and if he were ever charged with another family violence assault, the next offense could become a felony punishable by years in prison. The judge wasn't trying to scare him, he was making sure he understood exactly what he was agreeing to. The defendant nodded, but then his frustration began to surface. He told the court he felt like everyone was treating him as if he were a hardened criminal. He admitted that he had made mistakes when he was younger, but insisted he wasn't someone who was constantly getting into trouble. In his mind, it felt as though the court had already judged who he was. The judge listened patiently. Then he responded with a question that changed the tone of the hearing. "Did you think criminal court was going to be rainbows and gumdrops?" The courtroom fell silent. The judge explained that he wasn't attacking the defendant personally. His job was to explain the legal consequences that come with criminal convictions. Every warning he had given was required because those consequences would follow the defendant long after he left the courtroom. The defendant tried to clarify that he wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He simply felt misunderstood. But moments later, he made a statement that immediately stopped the plea process. He said, "I didn't assault anybody." The judge leaned forward. "If you're telling me you didn't commit the crime," he said, "I'm not taking your guilty plea." He explained that a guilty plea is an admission of guilt. The court would never allow someone to plead guilty while simultaneously claiming innocence. If the defendant believed he was innocent, then the proper place to decide the case was a trial, not a plea agreement. Defense counsel quickly stepped in and asked for a short continuance so he could speak privately with his client. The courtroom appeared to be moving toward a routine resolution. The defendant was standing before the judge, his attorney beside him, and the case seemed headed toward a plea. But then the defendant said something that changed everything. Something the judge could not simply ignore. The hearing began with the defendant and his public defender appearing before the court. The prosecution was also present, and the parties were prepared to address the pending charges. The judge began going through the defendant's situation and the terms that would apply if the case moved forward. At first, everything appeared straightforward. But there was another issue the prosecution wanted the court to consider. The defendant had recently been released from jail and had reported to community corrections for drug testing. The results came back positive for several substances, including cocaine, THC, benzodiazepines, and Suboxone. The defense immediately raised an important question. The test had been taken only shortly after the defendant's release. That meant the substances could potentially have been consumed before he was released from custody. In other words, the positive test did not necessarily prove that he had used drugs while he was actually on bond. The defense argued that there was a possible window that needed to be considered. The prosecutor, however, was concerned about something much bigger. The defendant already had multiple OWI cases. There was also another pending OWI matter in Wayne County. And now the court was looking at a positive drug test involving multiple substances. The prosecutor argued that the defendant's history suggested a continuing problem with substance use and impaired driving. The concern wasn't simply whether he had used drugs. The concern was what might happen if he continued using them and eventually got behind the wheel. The judge shared that concern. He pointed out that the defendant had previous OWI convictions and additional recent cases. At some point, the judge said, luck could run out. Someone could get hurt. The defense pushed back. The attorney argued that there was no evidence the defendant had been driving while under the influence during this particular period. If the defendant was using drugs inside his own home, the defense argued, that was different from getting behind the wheel and putting other people directly at risk. The attorney suggested a different solution. Instead of increasing the bond or incarcerating the defendant, the court could require more frequent drug testing. Once a week could become 3 times a week. The court could even require daily testing if necessary. The defense argued that there were options between simply releasing the defendant and putting him back in jail. But the judge wasn't convinced. The court wasn't only looking at one failed test. It was looking at the defendant's history. Previous OWI convictions. More recent cases. Another pending case. And now positive drug results. The prosecutor emphasized that this wasn't an isolated incident. The defendant had previous convictions dating back years, along with newer OWI cases. The prosecutor also pointed out that the defendant's blood alcohol levels in the current cases had allegedly been extremely high. According to the prosecutor, the BAC levels were above .30. That made this situation even more serious. The defense continued to argue that there was no conclusive proof the defendant had used drugs after being released on bond. But the judge wasn't necessarily asking whether the prosecution could prove that exact point beyond every doubt. The judge was deciding whether the existing bond conditions were appropriate given the overall circumstances. And that distinction mattered. After hearing both sides, the judge made his decision. The defendant's bond would be changed. It would no longer remain a personal recognizance release. The court set the bond at $25,000 cash or surety. But that wasn't the only important part of the hearing. The defendant was also prepared to waive his right to a preliminary examination. The judge carefully explained what that meant. A preliminary examination would normally require the prosecution to show probable cause that the alleged offenses occurred and that the defendant committed them. By waiving that hearing, the defendant understood that the cases would move forward to circuit court without that preliminary examination. The defendant confirmed that he understood. He waived the hearing. The prosecution waived it as well. The defendant then stood mute and waived the formal reading of the charges. The court entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. The cases were bound over to circuit court. A pre-trial hearing was scheduled for September 24, 2025. At this point, it looked like the hearing was finally coming to an end. But there was still one thing hanging over the proceedings: the defendant's decision about the plea. And that's where the hearing took an unexpected turn. As the judge continued addressing the defendant began expressing frustration about how he was being viewed. He felt as though the court was treating him like someone who was automatically dangerous simply because of his history. The defense tried to explain that the defendant's positive test did not necessarily establish drug use while on bond. The attorney continued to argue that the court could manage the situation through testing and supervision. But the judge wanted the defendant to understand exactly what he was facing. Then came the statement that changed the entire direction of the hearing. The defendant said, in substance, "I didn't assault anybody." The judge immediately stopped. That single statement created a serious problem with accepting a guilt